And we're back live here on the Speakeasy. Our first guest tonight actually was on an earlier incarnation of this program, as I mentioned before, some years ago, Noam Chomsky. He's the author of many best-selling political works and is also a professor of linguistics and philosophy at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. And he's actually credited with revolutionizing modern linguistics. He has sort of two hats on, and he's going to be here with us tonight to talk about Imperial Ambitions, Conversations on the Post-9/11 World, which is a book of interviews with David Barsamian, and it's published by Metropolitan Books. And hello, we want to welcome you to the program.
Glad to be with you.
Well, thank you so much, and just a fantastic book, as are all of them that I've read. I'd like to talk a little bit about imperialism as a word. I know linguistics being your field, and is this something that's becoming more accepted as a positive in some way?
Well, actually, it's not a word that I tend to use very much. It was the editors who chose the title. It's too vague for my tastes. Covers lots of different things. There are all sorts of forms of coercion and domination. Some have been called imperialism, some not. Now it's ambivalent. I mean, there are open calls that the United States should become a more dedicated imperial power in the old sense. This book by a Harvard professor, Neil Ferguson, who essentially advocates that the U.S. ought to take on an imperial role, and this is not considered outlandish. And on the other hand, imperialism has such a violent and brutal history that it's not surprising that many people regard the term with severe distaste or hatred.
But it does seem that some people almost admire it for that reason, which is disturbing to me.
The imperialists always admired themselves.
You talk in the book about preemptive war versus actually preventative war, which is what I'm saying, the Bush administration was selling the Iraq war as in the first incarnation of what they were doing. Would you care to talk a little bit about the sort of changing reasons we have for being in Iraq that we're being told?
Well, it's very straightforward. If you go back to Bush's speeches, also Blair, Colin, Powell, Condolezza Rice, and the rest, they stressed constantly what they called a single question. The single question was, will Saddam Hussein give up his weapons of mass destruction? That was the single question on which Bush received authorization for the use of force from Congress. It was the single question that was driven home over and over in speeches, conferences, and so on. And in fact, it did. There was a government media propaganda campaign which convinced a majority of Americans that they were in imminent danger because of the threat of Saddam Hussein, because of his weapons of mass destruction, his ties to al-Qaeda, his involvement with 9/11, and so on. The U.S. was the only country in the world, in fact, in which people were actually afraid of Saddam Hussein.
Right.
Everyone hated him, but they weren't afraid of him, even the neighboring countries that he'd invaded. But the United States was really driven off the international spectrum by that single question, and also the ties to terror and to al-Qaeda. Well, the single question was answered very quickly. Within 2 or 3 months, it was evident that the UN inspectors had been correct, and that there was no evidence of weapons of mass destruction programs, let alone weapons. So that was dropped. The talk about ties to al-Qaeda continued. In fact, they continue to the present. Just a few days ago, it was revealed that their main source for the ties to al-Qaeda gave that information after rendition. Rendition means, it's just a fancy word for torture.
Right.
Send them someplace where he'll be tortured. So he gave the information in Egypt under torture, then disavowed it. That was that information. In any event, those those pretexts fell apart, though they are still reiterated, for example, by Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist not long ago. But it was clear you couldn't get along with that for very long, so it was shifted. Turned out that the reason was not weapons of mass destruction and ties with Al-Qaeda. The reason was what the liberal press now calls President Bush's messianic mission to bring democracy to Iraq and the Middle East and the world and so on. And that's by now become a virtual cliche. I mean, you can't read a newspaper or even scholarly article without, with very rare exceptions, without its opening by a discussion of the president's vision of democracy, his mission to bring democracy, and so on. The evidence for that is, in fact, restricted to the declarations of leaders. There's no other evidence other than the fact that Bush and Blair and others now declare it after having abandoned their first pretexts. But if we really feel we live in North Korea, then the fact that the dear leader said it makes it true.
Right.
The evidence against it is overwhelming. I mean, even in Iraq. In Iraq, the United States fought tooth and nail to prevent elections and was only compelled to agree to them by overwhelming mass resistance, nonviolent resistance, real triumph of nonviolent resistance, not the insurgents. They didn't want the elections any more than Bush did. But the just mass demonstrations and protests, many of them initiated by the Grand Ayatollah Sistani. And finally, the United States had to back down after many, many efforts to deter or eliminate elections and allow them to take place. The next act is to, the next commitment is to try to undermine and subvert them, and that's what's going on right now. So, for example, any vocal, almost the entire articulate part of the spectrum in Iraq, and in fact overwhelmingly Iraqi public opinion, is calling for withdrawal, or at least a very firm timetable for withdrawal. The last poll, they've stopped releasing polls because the results are unpleasant.
Not what they
but
like.
Sometimes they leak. The last one that leaked was one taken by the British Ministry of Defense, leaked a couple of weeks ago in England. I don't even know if it's even been reported here. They found that 82% of the population wanted the U.S. forces, the coalition forces, U.S. and British forces, to leave. 1% thought that they were improving security, and about 45% favored attacks against them. The Parliament has a National Security Commission, and they called for, issued a declaration calling for a definite, quick timetable for withdrawal. But Bush and Blair say we're not going to give any timetable for withdrawal. So our commitment to democracy is that you can say what you want, but we're going to do what we do.
Right, and this commitment to democracy, which is the new excuse, as you mentioned, and no one ever really comes out and says anything much about oil in this administration.
No, you're not allowed to.
Except for the cost of it, I guess.
No, you're not allowed to. In fact, in commentary either, if you notice in the press and journals and so on, that we're supposed to believe, the kind of official line is that the United States would have invaded, or as they call it, liberated Iraq, even if it was an island in the Indian Ocean, with its main product was lettuce and pickles. I mean, unless you believe that, you're what's called a conspiracy theorist.
Right.
That's in the United States, or maybe parts of Western Europe. You go to the rest of the world, including Iraq, and the population just takes it for granted that the purpose of the war was what it obviously was, to take control of Iraq's immense oil resources and to strengthen the already strong U.S. position in dominating the global oil resources, mainly in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
Well, why else would they do it? It's ridiculous.
Well, I mean, if you're going after somebody to get rid of a dictator, perhaps Iraq would not have been the first choice in the first place. Maybe, I mean, you mentioned in Imperial Ambitions, you talk a little bit about Korea and North Korea in particular, and you notice that Korea was saying they had weapons of mass destruction while the U.S. was still beating that horse with the Iraqis. And
the U.S. has no interest in getting rid of dictators. It has always supported them in the past. It continues to support them in the present. That's true of the Bush administration. There's a whole list of dictators they're supporting, and many of them are, as bad or worse than Saddam Hussein. Furthermore, they supported him.
Yeah, for quite a while.
Well, I mean, it's kind of interesting. You have to admire the discipline of the press. There is a trial going on. Saddam Hussein is now being tried for his crimes. A lot of coverage of that. The crime, he's being tried right now for crimes committed in 1982, when he's accused of being involved in the murder of 160 people. Well, 1982 is a quite interesting year in Iraq-U.S. relations. 1982 is the year when the Reagan administration took Iraq off the list of states supporting terror so that they would be able to provide their friend Saddam Hussein with substantial aid, including means to develop weapons of mass destruction, biotoxins, and so on. That's 1982. And they continued to do so right through his worst atrocities, the gassing of the Kurds, and so on. In fact, after the 1991 war, Bush continued, first Bush, to support Saddam. He authorized him effectively to crush the Shiite rebellion in the South that probably would have overthrown him. All of this was well after the invasion, the war with Iran was over, and in fact, Bush, again, number one, made it very clear what the goal was. It was explicit. It was formal. The goal was to support U.S. exporters and to maintain what they call stability in the Middle East. In fact, when Bush authorized the crushing of the Shiite rebellion, New York Times openly, Thomas Friedman, others said, we have to do this. It's because Saddam Hussein offers better hope for the stability of the region than those who are trying to overthrow him. Stability is just another word for U.S. control. So it was quite open and frank, and there's no ambiguity about it. But try to find a word about it as the trial goes on for crimes in 1982 when the U.S. started. And that's just one. We can go through a long list.
Long list, right. I'm speaking with Noam Chomsky, professor of linguistics and philosophy at MIT, and author of Imperial Ambitions, Conversations in the Post-9/11 World. It's interesting that Harold Pinter actually made quite a heated pronouncement at his Nobel acceptance this week or last week.
2 days ago. Yeah.
Pretty much in line with what you just said, and I wonder if that's becoming a more spoken about phenomenon, the fact that the U.S. has done this.
Well, he could say it there, but I presume you saw the reaction here. Here it's just treated with contempt and derision, kind of a silly playwright. What does he know?
Right, I guess.
I haven't seen a serious comment on it.
In the States, in the...
Or on NPR or anywhere else. Maybe there was one, I didn't see it.
Well, there's a very deep subtext to what we're talking about here, and that is, of course, propaganda and the free press, or not, as it were. And there's been a lot coming out in the news just in this past week, again, in the news, whether we can trust it or not, but about these placed stories in Iraq. We knew about the ones that were here, and I'm sure there are many more than what we know about.
Yes, but I think that's all true, and it's good that it's coming out. But in my own view, it's about, it's kind of like a toothpick on a mountain. I mean, the main propaganda is very straightforward. I mean, I wish I had the resources to to research the Soviet press during the invasion of Afghanistan. But I can predict, and from the translations I'm pretty sure, that it would have been very much like the U.S. coverage of the Iraq War. There would be complaints, there were in fact complaints about Russian boys who are dying, the terrible conditions, the terrorist forces, but the framework would be, how are we doing? Like a high school newspaper reporting the local football team.
Right.
How are our guys doing? Are they making out okay? Did the coach make some mistakes? Can we do it better, or should we maybe not get involved in this, and so on. Try to find something that differs from that framework. That's like the Russian press during the invasion of Afghanistan.
Yeah, and also they use anything you say is thrown back saying, well, you're against the troops, you're against the people going over there then.
Which is exactly what they said.
Yeah.
I mean, Russian soldiers were dying. They had to support the troops. I mean, do we accept that point of view about the Russians in Afghanistan? Well, obviously not. In fact, we regard it as disgusting.
Right.
But if it's disgusting for them, it's worse for us. It's much worse for us because they could at least plead fear. They were living in a totalitarian state.
Yeah.
We have no excuses, just cowardice.
Well, it also seems it's pulling on some of the guilt from Vietnam that's still there, a lot that hasn't been dealt with from Vietnam, and the fact that soldiers came back and there were bad feelings toward them. And in a way, there's...
Well, that's mostly propaganda. There have been studies, careful studies, of the alleged attacks on soldiers and so on, and nobody can find any evidence for it.
Oh, I don't mean physical attacks. I just think that there were some weird feelings for them.
Well, a lot of people were against the war.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean they're against the soldiers.
Right.
In fact, the peace movement was very supportive of the soldiers. And they were setting up coffee houses, sports systems, and so on.
Right.
But yes, they were against the leadership. And in fact, they weren't against it anywhere near enough, in my opinion. So, I mean, the propaganda, people forget how the Vietnam War was treated. I mean, during the Vietnam War, the media were much worse than they are now. Mm-hmm. There is just no protest against the war. None. I mean, the most protest was, we're not doing too well.
Yeah.
That's kind of like the German press after Stalingrad. There was at a time when, by 1970, about 70% of the population of the United States regarded the war, I'm quoting the polls, as fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake. Try to find one phrase like that in the mainstream media.
Yeah.
That's 70% of the population. The most you could hear was, well, it's a mistake. We tried to, with benign intentions, and sort of went wrong, and it's costing us too much.
But did you feel that there were more true believers for that war than there were? It's not clear to me whether the people who started the Iraq War, were any of them true believers in this stuff they were selling people, or was it really just calculated?
Well, it's hard to know. I mean, maybe they talked themselves into it. I mean, it's inconceivable that any person of intelligence could have switched from the single question to our messianic mission in 10 minutes and still look themselves in the mirror.
Yeah, and they kind of keep Cheney hidden throughout all that because not a friendly.
But the same was true in Vietnam. I mean, the story in Vietnam was we're defending ourselves from the Russians or the Chinese or somebody who weren't there. We were attacking South Vietnam. But nevertheless, there were undoubtedly plenty of people who believed it.
Mm-hmm. Well, while you say the press doesn't seem to be really doing its job here, there does seem to be something of a crack in the facade now with the Bush administration. It seemed to have come about during, I guess the Plame case and the Harriet Miers thing seemed to really be a bad thing for him.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think that there is criticism of incompetence, corruption, and so on, and that's good. But if you went back to the Soviet press, they also criticized incompetence and corruption. The real question is, what is the framework? I mean, let's go back to a high school newspaper and the local football team. Mm-hmm. I mean, they'll criticize corruption and incompetence, but they accept the basic framework of how's our side doing. That's not reporting. So
what can a person do to step outside of that framework? What would you suggest to people? How do they take action? I mean, you mentioned in Imperial Ambitions how it's more the professors now than the students who are the anti-war activists, it seems.
I don't think I said that.
Oh, that was in one of the part of the maybe older interviews. But.
Yeah, maybe. I don't really think it's true. Nor was it ever true. What I may have said, and I certainly believe, is most of the protest is not coming from students. Mm-hmm. It's coming from grassroots. But that's been true See, the 1960s were unusual historically in that most of the center of a lot of the protest was coming from students. That's not usually the case, and it hasn't been the case since. You take a look at let's say the solidarity movements beginning in the 1980s that in connection with Central America, they've now spread around the world. Now that was an incredible phenomenon. It's the first time in the history of Western conquests, hundreds of years. First time that people from the attacking country actually went to live with the victims, to try to help them, to maybe a white face would give them a little protection and so on. And that was thousands, tens of thousands of people. But they were not mostly coming from, nobody ever thought of that in Vietnam or French in Algeria or any other time. That was coming mostly from Main Street. Mm-hmm. It was coming from churches in the Midwest and Southwest. Some of the main support groups had Christian evangelical roots.
So do you think that the internet can help with this then? Or, I guess it would also be used against us as well, but it can help to bring people together and therefore bring some hope to this situation that we have now.
Definitely. It's been used pretty effectively as a mode of interaction and communication. We're a very depoliticized society. People don't work together on things, no political parties and so on. But through the internet, people have been able to interact. It's been a source of information. It's a way of getting around mainstream media. But we shouldn't, underestimate the possibilities. It's a very hopeful situation here. Mm-hmm. There's an enormous gap between public opinion and public policy. And if you look at the studies of public opinion, which are done pretty intensively in the United States, you find that both political parties are far to the right of the general population on a whole host of major issues. And in fact, this is so much the case that the press literally doesn't publish the major studies.
Right. So there is hope, definitely.
Definitely. I think this country ought to be an organizer's paradise. What's missing is mostly will and commitment.
Yeah, there is hope. I saw that they were going to check into the Texas redistricting controversy and things like that.
Well, they might. That was an incredible scandal. In fact, if it hadn't been for that redistricting, which was just outrageous, the Republicans would have lost votes in the Congress in the last election.
Right. And I think everybody's looking toward 2006 now.
The main thing to look for is an authentic opposition party. It's rather striking that what's going on right now is very interesting in contemporary political history. The Bush administration is shooting itself in the foot on issue after issue.
Right.
And the Democrats are getting essentially no gain from it. The only gain they're getting is that the Republicans are losing. Yeah. If there's a genuine opposition party, they'd be making hay out of this.
Right. Well, they're going out there saying we should make flag burning illegal.
Well, yeah, they just can't do anything with it, and the reason is basically they're not all that different. How are they going to criticize the Iraq War since, as Bush correctly says, you supported it?
Yeah, that's true. And meanwhile, they're trying to distract us with things, as always. After all, they're trying to steal Christmas now. It seems like the big thing this year.
Right. Distraction is very important. You have to keep people's attention away from issues because of their stand on issues.
Who did take Christmas? Who took that away? So ridiculous.
Well, actually, it was probably the Emperor Constantine, but...
Well, Noam Chomsky, thank you so much for coming on the program. It's always such a pleasure to talk with you, and I hope that you will come back in the future and talk some more with us.
Hope so.
I know you always have fantastic books, and Imperial Ambitions, Conversations on the Post-9/11 World, and anything else you have out there you'd like to
Yeah,
mention?
There's one coming along. I'm just proofreading it at the moment. So pretty soon should be out.
Okay, well, we'll talk to you when that's made paper.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Yep.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.